facts that are called conscious but aren't. Um, to jump into the chase, it turns out that the crucial consideration here is whether or not a relationship involves um, efficient causes. Um, theories of cognition commonly require that there be a causal relationship between what perceives or knows and what is perceived or known. Unfortunately, such causality often seems to be invoked rather uncritically, as obviously the way perceptions and empirical beliefs are connected with the external world. But the nature of this causality and its relation to what is properly conscious in such perceptions and beliefs is left unclear. Here I call attention to the impossibility of a conscious cognitive relationship being wholly or partly constituted by an efficient cause, the sort of cause that changes something or brings something about. Actually, efficient causes are the only causes you probably heard, unless you're a philosopher. Aristotle had 4 causes, one of which was an efficient cause. And that's the only kind of cause, that Aristotle invented anybody ever talks about anymore. The reasoning behind this is quite straightforward. In fact, it's so straightforward as to lack initial credibility. There are only 2 or 3 essential lines in the proof. The first is that it is a necessary condition for an efficient causal relationship that at least one of the relata be altered. If you're boiling water by putting unboiled cool water over a flame and nothing happens to the water, then you can't very well say that the heat of the flame is a causal, an efficient cause of the boiling water. The second one is really very important, and that is that it's a necessary condition for being a conscious cognitive act that neither of the relata are changed. The third point to note is the nature of change itself, which we don't have to go into very deeply. And then the fourth one is really so straightforward as to be amusing. It's analytically true that the tautology that one is conscious of that of which one is conscious is true. Obviously, one and the same relationship cannot both change the relata and leave them as they are. To follow why 2 follows from 3 and 4. Think of it as a kind of King Midas touch, such that whatever King Midas attempts to touch changes into something else. And whatever King Midas attempts to touch that acts on King Midas changes King Midas to someone else. Now, nothing could be consciously present to King Midas if by and continuously with the same act by which King Midas attempts to make it present to him, the cognitive object were altered. As consciously present to King Midas, the cognitive object would be present as it is. How else could one item be consciously present to another? But as simultaneously altered, the conscious object would be present at King Midas as something other than the conscious object, something which it is not. Conversely, if the cognitive object operated as an efficient cause on King Midas would become something other than King Midas is. He's someone else, like, say, Donald Trump. It might seem that this deconstruction would be iterated through a regress of failed cognitive conscious relationships and always altered relata. But in fact, the combination of these 2 very different relationships in one unitary act would block both. There would be no conscious cognitive relationship. Nothing would be consciously known or perceived, and there would be nothing that could know or perceive it. The difficulty here is not, as with Plato, about knowing change, or things that change. It's about how we can know anything by changing it or being changed by it. For what is changing to be present as it is would be for it to be present as changing. Indeed, 2 implies that what is changing cannot be known as not changing, nor does 2 prevent any epistemic object from being changed, provided it is not being changed by that particular or any other conscious relationship. Similarly, what is ruled out is not the possibility of having a conscious cognitive relationship to an efficient cause. But the possibility of an efficient cause making itself present to a conscious subject, by acting on it as an efficient cause, or by the conscious subject acting as an efficient cause on it. In the Platonic problem, what is changing is thought to be unknowable precisely because it is changing. The present point is that what is changing cannot be made knowable by causing it to be unchanging. I suggest that if the attempt to know what is changing is futile, it is because change is a metaphysical problem, not an epistemological problem about the nature of cognition. If this puzzle must be assigned a locus, it is surely better that it be metaphysical rather than cognitive. For what radically compromises our cognitive abilities compromises our ability to know anything about this or any other problem. From a causal perspective, it will seem grossly counterintuitive to require that a conscious subject not be changed. The whole point of a conscious cognitive relationship, it will be thought, is to change something that is not conscious of a cognitive object into something that is conscious of a cognitive object. And this will be viewed as an addition to or change in some feature or property of the conscious subject or its mental representation. But an informed representation or other mediator is not itself an informed conscious subject. And if the causal theory is applied consistently, the mediating representation must also act causally on the cognitive subject itself. Indeed, the degree to which what we're going to call the axiom of non-invasiveness, which is somewhat pretentious because axioms should be invented by old guys like Euclid. Indeed, the degree to which A and I is instantiated is the degree to which cognitive objectivity is achieved. It makes no difference whether the cognitive object is internal or external to the mind or brain. In either case, is one the subject of a cognitive conscious relationship by virtue of being changed by that same relationship to some other cognitive subject, nor is something an object of a cognitive conscious relationship by virtue of being changed to some other object. So what we have here is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Cognitive non-invasiveness is a necessary condition for a cognitive conscious relationship, but it's not sufficient. It does not show that every non-invasive relationship is a conscious cognitive relationship. The problem is to describe what that additional component is without referring to consciousness and therefore begging the issue. For example, 2 items well outside of each other's light cone can have the non-invasive abstract relationship of having the same shape, without, as far as we know, being intimately related in the way required by a conscious cognitive relationship. On the other hand, if physical objects could only be related to each other through efficient causes, they could have no real relationship at all. Now, the second half of this paper, I think, will come to you as a bit of a surprise. It should be obvious that any ANI, axiom of non-invasiveness, that the ANI is directly and convincingly contradicted by our own inner and outer experience. If your monitor, for example, in the room in which you are viewing it went completely dark, you would cease to have any visual consciousness at all, because there would be no pattern photons acting as efficient causes on your optical system. But I suggest it would be a mistake simply to conclude that at least one of the two proposals that are both quite convincing be ignored. What we have here is another classic antinomy, which, contrary to Kant, is pointing to something very fundamental that we don't understand and that isn't going to go away however routinely we dismiss it. But let us look for a minute at what the axiom of non-invasiveness brings to its side of the puzzle. Unlike the standard characterization of consciousness as an instance of what it is like something to be, ANI does not merely point someone familiar with the English idiom in the general direction of a cognitive consciousness. Neither the definiens nor the definiendum of ANI refers to any actual state or act of consciousness as experienced. Instead, it identifies a feature of one's cognitive consciousness that exploits an essential property of such consciousness, the absence of which is a feature present in non-conscious objects, a property that we can do something with, and that relates cognitive consciousness to what is non-conscious in a fundamental way. As an example of ANI's potential fruitfulness, consider that it suggests an approach to the relevance of consciousness to evolution, which may be viewed as an effort to organize alienating efficient causes into stable, integrated, self-sustaining neural systems that can approximate ANI, that can approximate cognitive non-invasiveness. The reason I use the odd term alienating is that if you view a system involving only efficient causes, you realize that they can't ever be related to each other as they are because they're constantly changing them. So it's a way of seeing all these subatomic particles and the like constantly trying to get in touch with each other and failing because the thing they're trying to get in touch with is constantly being changed. In physics, it makes it possible for the physicist to view ANI offers an insight into the limitations imposed by efficient causes on the self-contained world described by physics. And I just gave you an idea of what that would be. And incidentally, for something concrete, it rules out at least one version of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum wave function. So why has ANI been so long overlooked? Several possible explanations suggest themselves. One is the notion, possibly as old as Aristotle's, typing papers are stuck together here, as Aristotle's intelligible species, as something required by knowledge. That is to say, one must have a mental or neural representation of something causally reproduced in the mind or brain. The classical empiricist example is the wax-like mind stuff, upon which objects of sense are said to impress their likeness, or the tabula rasa, on which it is written. The present objection to these efficiently caused mental replica is that such an impression would alter the mind stuff. And one doesn't have to refer to it as mind stuff. It has a number of different identities. It could be passive intellect, a brain state, a neural network, a functional relationship, biocomputational software, or what have you. And if there's not to be a regress, the mind stuff offered would have to be the conscious subject itself, insofar as he or she is cognitively conscious. Obviously, this violates the axiom of non-invasiveness. Another problem is another problem may be that the current focus on qualia as the only, or at least the paradigmatic case of consciousness, is a distraction. By focusing on the mysterious occurrence of pains and pinches and patches of color and the like, qualia diverts attention from what it is for any one of these to be consciously present to a cognitive subject. Similarly, cognitive consciousness is imagined as a source of illumination, or originating somewhere in the brain, without considering what it is for something to be illuminated. So where are we with this? Whatever intractable puzzle A&I may present for philosophers, cognitive scientists, and physicists, the last because of its implications for efficient causes, neither is something we can do without. If efficient causal relationships did not change their relata, nothing would happen. And if conscious cognitive relations did not relate things without changing them, nothing would be known. Thank you for your attention. If there is anyone out there